You're listening to Sports Connections with David Smale, the show that brings you a fun and intimate look into connections throughout sports. Now here's your host, David Smale.
Kansas City is famous for a lot of things, not the least of which is the fact that in the past 8 years, we've won championships in 3 major sports leagues: Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball, and the National Football League. Of course, our city is best known for the best barbecue in the world. One of Kansas City's claims to fame is the sports architecture capital of the world, with the 3 largest sports design firms located here. Listen to these stats. In Major League Baseball, 21 of the 27 new ballparks were designed by Kansas City architecture firms. In the NFL, the number is 24 out of 32 designed by Kansas City firms. There are 30 NBA teams and 32 NHL teams, and several arenas host teams in both leagues. The Kansas City firms have designed 34 NBA and NHL or combo arenas. Our guest today, Tom Waggoner, has done some significant research on the subject. He's writing a book chronicling the 50-year plus history of sports architecture firms in Kansas City. Look for that one on the bookstore shelves soon. Tom, welcome to Sports Connections.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here today.
So how long have sports stadiums been a focus of Kansas City firms?
Well, it really started in 1968 when the Jackson County Sports Complex was built. The Kansas City Sports Authority had been developed prior to that, and their main goal, their main mission was to get a stadium built, get a complex built. And the original architect, the design architect, came from Denver, of all places, and he was a small scale firm, and he came to town with the big idea of 2 stadiums versus 1. And long story short, he connected up with what was one of the largest, if not the largest, firm at the time in Kansas City to partner, a firm called Kivett Myers, which eventually became part of HNTB.
Right. And so it just grew from there?
It did. So that was 1968. Both stadiums were opened in 72, 73. And there's one architect in particular that worked at Kivett Myers who was assigned as a young architect to work on Arrowhead, a gentleman named Ron Lubinsky. Well, he had this vision, this idea that there was a market to be had of single sport specific design stadiums. And
Right.
He followed his passion, started his own firm in the mid 70s, eventually ended up at HNTB, sort of back where he had been in a sense with the Kivett Myers acquisition. And in 1983, he and a handful of other architects that had been following him for a few years, almost 10 years at the time, left. And they started what became, in 1983, a firm called HOK Sport. And from there, the competition began because HNTB maintained their portfolio, some of their specific architects, and that really got the competition going here in town. And it's only grown since.
Now, you mentioned to me, and we talked about this ahead of time, that there was one magazine article that labeled Kansas City the sports architecture capital of the world.
Yes.
But it really is. Talk about that article and how that really just added to the momentum.
Yes. So in following up on HOK Sports starting in 1983, 5 years later, another group of architects working in sports and actually not always working in sports, but they left and started another new sports firm that was known as Ellerby Beckett. So by 1992, Architecture Magazine, which was a leading publication at the time, decided to, along with highlighting the newly completed ballpark at Camden Yards for the Baltimore Orioles, big spread on that, beautiful photos, they decided to profile these 3 firms. And so in that article, each firm got a page or 2 to talk about what they focused on and sort of bragging rights as to who was doing what. And in that article, the writer for Architecture Magazine said Kansas City is without a doubt the sports architecture capital of the United States.
And that's something the Chamber of Commerce and Sports Commission and organizations like that take and run with it. But it's really true. I mean, are there any other cities that can even come close to Kansas City's reputation?
No, there really isn't, David. And what's interesting is the 3 big firms, eventually there was a 4th firm that sort of landed here in town. I was actually one of the organizers of that. In 2004, a firm called 360 Architecture was the joining of 2 smaller firms. One did only sports and one did partial sports. So you had these 4 big firms, but there's also dozen, if not 2 dozen, smaller firms that had spun out of the larger firms, all with these same ties. Well, to no surprise, some of those individuals ended up going to different cities, to Dallas, to LA, to Phoenix, to New York. And so there's satellite locations of firms and individuals that came from Kansas City at some point or one or the other. But in terms of the mass, the critical mass of number of firms, the quantities, there's no place really on earth that can compete with Kansas City in terms of that quantity.
But why do you think Kansas City got that? Is it because of the area schools? I know K-State, where you went, has a good architecture program. Is it because of the universities, or did it just happen?
I think this, what was really interesting when, going back to Ron Lubinsky, and he had this vision that there was a market. And I think a lot of his contemporaries at the time, Ron is in his 80s now, obviously retired, but a lot of his contemporaries, I thought, I've understood from them and stories that they just thought he was a little bit off his rocker, that there was a market there. And I think because Kansas City, the two go hand in hand. His vision, along with the fact that in his backyard, our backyard, was the Truman Sports Complex.
Right.
And that the fact that there were 2 stadiums versus 1, and what had been fashionable at that time in the 1960s, and there were 12 or 14 of these stadiums built.
Yeah.
Busch Stadium was one in particular that was the closest to Kansas City,
Right.
Was a dual purpose stadium. Sort of you switch the seats around in the lower seating area
The
and you
cookie
end
cutter.
up with
The big
the
circle.
cookie cutter. Yes. And quite frankly, Ron Lubinsky he understood, as did other people, including the likes of Lamar Hunt and Jack Stedman, as the stories go. They understood that those stadiums really weren't great for either sport.
Yeah.
And they sort of campaigned on that to get 2 stadiums here. And I think once Ron had this vision that he was going to do this, it drew people to Kansas City, other sports owners, mainly starting in the NFL, because the first big stadium that he executed in 1987, although there was quite a gap from Arrowhead, was Joe Robbie Stadium down in Miami.
Right.
And what went along with that, David, that was really important, was Ron and his team, his core team of architects, had this vision, and they really sold it, and they made it happen at Joe Robbie sort of first. Was the idea of premium seating, indoor premium seating. Arrowhead had the club level. Originally, though, that club level was all open. Eventually, they enclosed it, the lobbies and the hospitality areas, in addition to the seats. But that was probably the component that really didn't have much of a life until it's got promoted here in Kansas City. What's interesting is that in 1965, the Houston Astrodome opened, and it had all sorts of gadgets and gizmos that a lot of people were attracted to going to see. And in some ways, they fed off each other.
And it's interesting because I remember when the news first came. I lived in Kansas City. I was born in 58. I lived here until the summer of 69, then moved to New York. So I wasn't here when the stadiums opened, but I remember the discussion, and there was people were almost incredulous. Like, why would you build 2 stadiums side by side? Why do you need more than one? And now, if my recollection is correct, Oakland was the very last city that had a stadium that served 2 different tenants. Is that correct?
That's what my research has also shown. That's exactly right, David, as I understand it.
And so the fact that Arrowhead and now Kauffman Stadium were so successful, and they're almost 50 years old, and they're still considered, in different ways among the best in their 2 leagues. From the Royals standpoint, or from baseball standpoint, one of the prettiest stadiums, and from football standpoint, one of the most efficient stadiums and loudest, which obviously is important in football. So it's that one gentleman that gets credit for basically changing the culture of sports architecture around the country, doesn't he?
That's correct. And, those of us there are a lot of people that work for him. The firm he started is now called Populous. They went through a name change in 2009. But, the fact that they became, the brand, and to this day, they're probably still the largest sports architecture firm with nearly 20 offices around the world. But people would leave these different firms and start. I was an example. I had a 2-person firm with a good friend of mine, Randy Bradar, who now works for J.E. Dunn Construction. We had a 2-person firm, and we were trying to do college sports. Well, there was a lot of that, and then some of us came to our senses and got into bigger firms, or we merged firms together. But the fact, and this is why I think not only is the quantity here, is the unbelievable quality of
Right.
technical and creative design, is because we're all here in town. We're all rivals. At the end of the day, we're all friends. We see each other at the coffee shops and the bars, and having it all here has had a huge impact on the quality and creativeness that literally has gone worldwide.
It's interesting. You mentioned this in an email to me yesterday or maybe this morning, that all of these firms still have momentum and still have name recognition, even though they all changed their names.
Yeah, that's right.
That's kind of interesting that their reputation is so firm, they can change their name and still people like, okay, we just got to call them something different. It's like if the Yankees decided to go back to the New York Highlanders, people would still know they'd won 27 world championships.
Yeah, that's right.
Since 2009, which I love to rub into my friends in New York. But they keep that they've got such a strong reputation. The name is almost not as important as the reputation itself. Is that correct?
That is correct. I've put together a linear timeline that literally goes 50 years, and I've also put together sort of an org chart, a family tree, if you will. And I've gone through that list of firms recently, and I would say 90% of those firms are absolutely still in business, and with the same people that started them. I think I've likened it. I've spent so much time with athletic directors for the last 30 years and around a handful of coaches, as I mentioned, but it's something you don't leave. There's very few architects that I have ever met in this business that I haven't known for 30 some years that have stayed as sports architects, because let's face it, it's a pretty exciting business to be on the sideline, to be in the suites, to work with coaches. But you have to remember, at the end of the day, you're hired to bring your expertise and to create the next really great thing. You're only as good as your last project in a lot of ways.
It's interesting, Tom. There's something different about sports architecture, because if you're seeing a TV drama or whatever that's in a building, they'll show the outside of the building real quick, and then they'll go to the inside stuff. Every time you turn on a game, you're seeing the stadium, and they usually have a blimp, flying over. So your work is prominent. They talk about the importance of the stadium to the game itself, Seattle Stadium and Arrowhead, and about the noise and from I hope it wasn't one of yours, but the one in Tampa St. Pete where the Rays play, about how it just the sound doesn't carry well and things like that. But the venue is so important to sports architecture. It's got to make you feel good being in that industry to see your work on TV on a regular basis.
It is. And it's not only that, it's really fun. I have 2 daughters, one's 31, one's 28. They're both in the design and construction industry now, but it's been fun to take them to events from the time they were 5 or 6 years old, to my project, to my stadium, and then see it on TV, or say, hey, Dad, I saw you on the sideline at the Auburn game last week when you were there at Jordan-Hare Stadium. And, I'll get screenshots standing on the side of on the sideline. And I'm certainly not the only one. That's sort of one of the perks, but you're also there to learn, and you're usually there with your clients. So you're usually doing business in some way, but it's very satisfying, David.
I would imagine that it is. Now, I ran through some of your clients, but not necessarily the stadiums or the arenas other than Madison Square Garden. So of all of them that you've done, which was your favorite project to be a part of?
So I get asked this question by friends, family, and when I have an occasional interview or a chance to talk, it's sort of a series of things. The Madison Square Garden was a really great thing. I was a young architect, late 20s, and to spend 3 years commuting almost weekly back and forth to New York City and just sort of navigating that city. And I tried to do as much of it as I could above ground. That was great. Working at Notre Dame Stadium was incredibly satisfying. I grew up watching those games with my father, my late father. That was great. I've had a 25-year continuous working relationship with the University of Missouri Athletic Department. I still serve as their master planner. That's been wonderful. I worked at Elon University on 2 small stadiums, football and soccer, and eventually my oldest daughter played soccer there and got to play in both of those.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of a moving thing. And right now I'm working at my alma mater at Kansas State. We have a $50 million end zone project that's about to finish construction.
Yeah.
And my youngest daughter is an engineer, and we're working together on that. So It's always a series of projects that have evolved and changed and affected, not only my career, but certainly my life and my family's life.
I had an opportunity to get to know Dick Enberg really well through the years. And I once asked him, he broadcasted college and pro football, college and pro basketball, Major League Baseball, track and field, golf, tennis. I said, which was your favorite? And he had a great response. What season is it? I'm guessing it's a similar thing with you. Which is your favorite? Well, what's the last one I worked on?
Yeah.
And it's not so much, it probably just as equally as much the facility as it is the people you were able to work with. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's very true. And, it's interesting. I actually never had a personal interest in baseball. I think I've worked on a handful of stadiums, and just the market is so specialized. In preparing for today, one of the things I was thinking about too, and it relates to, favorite project. One of the great things about that's been a 33-year journey of all this travel, this never-ending travel, is because these projects take on the short end 3 years and sometimes 5 or 6. And if you're lucky enough, you keep working at the same place for years and years. Is to be immersed in these different cultures. I mean, I've spent 5 years working at the University of Washington on Husky Stadium. That culture and the people and the mindset is a lot different than Auburn, Alabama, and a lot different than working at SMU at a private school, or working at a northern school versus a southern school in terms of the climate, in terms of the food and the history and the culture. That's been a side benefit that, despite the number of hotel nights and airplane rides, that's been really satisfying to just see these different cultures, because you do become part of their families in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm sure. Talk about give me sports architecture 101, the first day of class, the introduction before you actually start teaching anything. What goes into designing a sports stadium? Yeah.
Well, obviously it's even if it's a specific stadium, let's say it's a football stadium. One of the first questions you might say, whether it's a renovation or a new, is what else will this be used for? Well, 30 years ago, in fact, you and I may have been at the same concert at Arrowhead seeing the Eagles play. Well, because the music industry has evolved, and big concerts have evolved, and in a lot of ways evolved away because of how music is made and distributed. Those are less important right now. But you want to know that too. Obviously, you get into the technical aspects, the program. What are the parts and pieces that make, and when you hire an office expert or an apartment building complex, or in the case of a sports architect, there's certain knowledge that you bring to the table that occurs in every venue. Like, what are the parts and pieces of a press box for football? Well, it's ever evolving. And in a lot of ways, you draw on not only the last 20 years, but you really draw on the last project you worked on, because those things change. Security has changed drastically, as we all know. And now we have health concerns and health issues. Technology changes. And so you bring all that to the table and you apply those things. And then an area that I never was personally involved in, because it is so specialized, are like the sight lines, the views to the field, to the baseline, to the backcourt line, whatever it is. I know I worked on a couple of fascinating projects at Duke. And all I was hired to do, and it took 3 years to actually execute these, was to put in the seats, the bleachers, the fold-out bleachers behind each basket. And believe it or not, each end was different than the other, because one was the seniors standing area, the other was the band. The fire department was all worked up because the building was overloaded as it was. And so, you bring all this knowledge and you do a lot of listening. The people that own the buildings and run the buildings and operate the buildings are your partners, and they're also the historians where they've had problems. And after Notre Dame Stadium, built in the late 20s, had a whole different set of issues and criteria than, say, working at a stadium that's 20 years old that also needs a fix up. So there's a lot of answers to that, but I think you listen a lot and you bring your toolbox to the table.
Sure. Do you get Do you get any pushback from the people at Duke when they find out you have a long-standing relationship with North Carolina? Does that help you or hurt you?
Yeah. So 20 years ago, my business partner, we had a two-person firm. We had a chance to work at Duke, literally with Coach K, on planning a training facility. And that connection had been my connection at SMU, who left. And he was the sports information director. And I called him up and said, look, I started my own firm. I need some work. Do you have any projects? And he said, yeah, we have some bleachers we need to do in the end zone at Cameron. Well, before you know, within months, we're working with Coach K. Okay, that work went on to be a design build project with Coach K, and it sort of never was executed. Well, then fast forward about 10 or 12 years, and Bubba Cunningham, who's one of my close friends and clients, leaves Tulsa to become the AD at North Carolina. And I went out there immediately and started working with him. We did a big master plan, which took almost a year to author that. And one of his questions was, I know you used to do a little work at Duke. Are you anymore? And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, you're not going to, are you? And I said, no, I'm not. So there's so much work to go around. And, interesting, my firm at the time was working at North Carolina State. And he said, that's fine. No, I'm not worried about that. It's the folks over in Durham. So,
well, they're 8 miles apart. So that rivalry is certainly more.
That's
more
exactly
heated.
right.
Is it harder to design a baseball stadium? And I know you said you haven't done many, but you've been involved with some. Baseball stadium, football stadium, soccer stadium, or something else? Or do they all have their own challenges and their own advantages?
I think they do all have their own challenges. I will say the little I know about baseball, and it's evident for anybody that follows Major League Baseball and I suppose college, there is some leeway, obviously, on the outfield configuration of the wall.
Right.
Populous has designed so many of those buildings here in town, and there's some really clever things they've done with some angles and some flagpoles and, the things you can put in the outfield, whether it's fountains or grass or hot tubs, whatever it is. So I think baseball does lend itself. And baseball stadiums are relatively complicated, the seating bowl. You might have 15 different seating configurations because they're all different price points. Football, maybe not so much. Soccer, the pitches there's some leeway on the pitch, but there's also a lot of opinions about how a coach wants to coach the team, how big he or she wants that pitch. Now, when you get into arenas, it's a much different, more complicated, I think, in a lot of ways. It's a lot less people. It's a lot smaller building. But because it is enclosed, you have issues that are code related to safely exiting in a fire. There's not much of a chance of a fire at a baseball or football game, but there is the chance of a lightning storm and a hailstorm, right? So you have those issues. But I think when you get into an arena with the HVAC systems, I was involved as the lead architect on Missouri's Mizzou Arena, which started in 2001. We had just started work when 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden, we're thinking differently about how that building needs to be secured, including the air intakes for the mechanical system. And that's 20 years ago, right? So there's new issues now, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, between health and security. But it's amazing to see an arena come together when you get up in the trusses. T-Mobile is an example. Unbelievable to see the scale of what holds up that roof.
Absolutely. And I would think that baseball is easier because it's more flexible, and it's also harder because there are no set rules for how high the fence should be.
That's right.
The football field is 100 yards by 53 yards, and you have 10-yard end zones on each side. Yeah. And like you say, in soccer, the pitch is pretty much the same. Baseball, I mean, you can have Kauffman Stadium that's one of the biggest, and you could have Wrigley Field that I could hit it out of. So it's probably different. It's probably harder and easier for the same reason, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. I remember I spent a lot of time at the old Texas Rangers ball stadium. They've had 2 stadiums in the last 25 years.
Right.
When it first opened, I was working at SMU, and I can remember going to games, the ballpark at Arlington, and it's obviously the same size field and about the same size seating capacity as Royal Stadium, Kauffman Stadium. But the fact that that's an enclosed building, it was essentially a stadium inside a box, and there was actually an office building that was out in the outfield. But the fact that it's enclosed and you are in this box, even though it's the same size field and the same general population, the feeling is so much different than being at Kauffman Stadium because it's wide open and the sky is the limit, and you have the fountains and you have the highway, and then you have, looking, as far as you want to look.
Yeah. It seems like designing stadiums these days, and maybe it's always been this way, but it seems to be more so that it's can you top this game? I mean, obviously Jerry Jones Stadium Forget what the current name is, AT&T Stadium in Dallas,
Yes.
Has the screen that's bigger than a lot of fields.
That's right.
But then the Mercedes-Benz Dome in Atlanta has a circle of, so no matter where you are, you have a big screen to look at.
That's right.
Where do you come up with the next big thing idea?
Yeah. It's really interesting. You mentioned those stadiums. And NFL is a good example. If you just look at some of the recent stadiums, Mercedes, going back to AT&T, way back, which is probably 8 or 9 years ago, 10 years ago down in Dallas, Mercedes-Benz, MetLife, the new stadium in Los Angeles that has two teams, two tenants, the new stadium in Las Vegas. One of the things I think you see is the ideas of the latest premium seats. Those are really interesting, and that's what drives so much of the revenue and the sales and the naming rights and all that. But the scale of those is so small compared to where can you really make a big splash, whether you're usually it's sort of a partnership between the owner and the architect doing the design work. Well, you can do it with technology, and what's the biggest thing you can do? You can make the biggest TV in the country like Jerry Jones did, or then you can turn and you can make it round. Or then you can make it wavy. Okay, that's one thing certainly. The other thing is the roof and the experience. Do you have a fixed roof? Do you have an operable roof? Do you have a translucent roof? Do you have cables? Do you have trusses? And all those things add up. Not only sort of just sitting there, but the things you can do with those from a lighting standpoint and a projecting video standpoint. They become a giant movie screen in a sense, a giant advertising screen. And I think what's interesting, David, is the scale of the splash of sort of outdoing the folks down the road is certainly one thing. Now, when you get into college sports, one of the things that has been unbelievable that I've been a part of, and so have others here in town and around the country, are all the things they do for student athletes to recruit them. The gadgets they have to recruit, also the quality of the academic and tutoring centers, also the quality of the sports med and rehab, because these student athletes, they get hurt, they want to get a degree, the school begs for them to get a degree, and there's been hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars spent at the collegiate level to put those things in place. Oh, in addition to a great stadium, a great field, a great locker room. But recruiting is just unbelievable to see what it's got. And it's also a really, in a sense, clever tool for athletic departments to raise money, because you're doing sort of the mind, body, and spirit. Yeah, they compete, but we also want to take care of them as young people.
So do you enjoy working with colleges or professional franchises more, or are they just different?
Well, they are different. And the answer is here. I spent the first 3 years of my career, 1988 to 1991, working in New York on Madison Square Garden. I've spent the entire time since 1991 just working on college sports.
Okay.
So that's where I sort of found it. It sort of found me in some ways when I was working on a couple of projects that did well from a PR standpoint. It taught me a lot. But what's interesting too is the market is so specialized. One of the reasons I stayed away from baseball, I think, as an architect, was there's so much to learn just in football and basketball, just in college. It's hard to spread yourself too thin. And if you look at the sports firms, the larger scale sports firms that do the larger projects, again, 4 of those firms are here in town. They have their people divided up as sort of college specialists. You might have MLS specialists, because not only do you get to know the sport, you get to know the people that are in the sport that hire you or don't. So that takes a lot of time to get to know and maintain and appreciate those relationships.
Obviously, you like what you're doing. So how long do you think you'll stay in the business?
I just turned 63. I went into a consulting role with my own little consulting firm a year ago. I really like that because I actually work in some cases for people who used to be my client. I become an adjunct to what they have in-house. Because athletic departments in these Power 5 conferences are so complex. Yeah. They are so involved with the things that the facilities people inside athletic departments have to deal with. So I'm enjoying doing that. And as you and I have talked, I'm trying to take everything I've learned and put it into a book. That's a really important goal to me personally. I think I'm inside the red zone on getting there. Yeah. But it's really fun to talk about something that, again, when I got into really researching 3 or 4 years ago, I thought I knew 90% of what had happened. I think I probably knew 10%.
Huh.
And every time I have a conversation with somebody, I learn something new. Every time I lecture, somebody will come up afterwards and say, you know what? I remember being at the Beatles concert at Municipal Stadium, when they played here. That history and those stories from people that are happenstance, or, I worked with Lamar Hunt when he was first setting up the team. I did this, I did that. Those are just exciting for me to hear. And to be able to share them, because those people aren't going to be around forever, and those stories aren't going to be around forever. So I'm pretty happy these days doing what I'm doing.
Sure. So the book is coming out. You're almost done with it. You're basically in the process of looking for a publisher. So it should be out sometime this year. Is that the goal?
That is several years ago, I said I wanted to have it done by 2020. So I'm burning daylight. I do want to move on. I want to understand the aspects of what's involved with sort of that back end, that delivery, the construction of it in a sense. So yes, it is an absolute goal for 2021 for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you know, I've done a few books.
Yes.
It's not nearly as complicated because, when you're working to put a book together, you don't have to worry about wiring and lighting and sound and filtration and all that stuff. But you really are building something where the written word is part of it, just like the game is part of it, but you got to build around that. So I think that's a good analogy. We'll wrap up with this, Tom. What are you passionate about outside of architecture?
Well, spending time with my wife. She's taught at the KU Med Center for years. She's a speech pathologist. She's semi-retired, similar to me. She does some consulting work at a few hospitals. Both of our daughters live here in town. Both are married. We have our first grandchild who's 3 months old. Our other daughter just announced she's pregnant. Both girls are working in the same profession I am in, essentially the architecture, engineering, and construction business. I have time now to ride my bike a lot, try to get my bogey golf a little better than, 18 handicap. And those are the things I'm passionate about: cooking, spending time with friends. And when the time comes, a little more travel. A lot of our friends have been fortunate to retire in their early 60s where we are. And it's great to go around and see them and stay with them and experience where they are. So I'm in a good place. I'm very lucky.
It's travel that doesn't have work attached to it and where you can take your wife is what you're talking about.
That's right. That's exactly.
You've had plenty of travel experience.
Yes, I have. And what's really fun right now, I'm working at the University of Missouri and I'm working at Kansas State, as I mentioned, and I can hop in the car and go there in 2 hours and be home that night. So that's a lot different offering than wondering if I'm going to make it home to KCI. So
yeah, for sure. And you mentioned you have a grandchild, boy or girl?
A little boy, yes.
Is there a better role that you've ever had than being a grandpa?
No, it's really exciting. And like I said, our younger daughter just announced she's going to have a baby, and they just found out it's going to be a boy. So after having raised 2 girls, which we traveled all over the country with, my wife and I, in sports, whether it be soccer or volleyball or both, it's exciting to have some little boys and try and learn about what that's going to be like.
Yeah, I've got 2 granddaughters, 5 and 3, and I can tell you can be having the worst day imaginable, and those little girls walk into the front door and say, "Grandpa," and they run over and jump in your arms.
Yeah,
your day is perfect. So I can tell you for sure that you will enjoy these coming years very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, Tom, I appreciate your time very much. This has been interesting for me. I've known for a while that Kansas City had this reputation, but I didn't know why. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. And I hope a lot of people will learn something from this and people will buy your book when it comes out.
Thank you for the time today, David.
Thanks for listening to Sports Connections with David Smale. Make sure to subscribe, follow, and rate the show from your favorite podcast platform. You can learn more about David Smale and his work by visiting davidsmalebooks.com. Don't forget to join us weekly for new episodes. Until next time.